So, good afternoon to you all. We've got the question that we're going to explore this afternoon about, is there a God? It's a question that you've probably all asked yourself from time to time. 2000, when there was the atheist bus campaign, which had the slogan on the side of the bus, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." That was back in 2009. Now that's a pretty bold assertion, that is, to say that there's no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. And the assertion is on the basis that if there is no God, then science must have found the answers to all of these questions, like how did the universe come into existence? How did life come into existence? How did your life come into existence? Because life is a really precious thing. And sometimes we gloss over it and don't realize what a miracle life really is. So we're going to explore for a few minutes now the question about, is there a God? This assertion that if God doesn't exist, how did all of these things come into existence? Because if there isn't a God, then logically existence on their own. The question therefore then comes is, does science have the answer for this? If there isn't a God and mankind has discovered these things through science, has science got the answers? Science is all about the study of knowledge. And science is very much experimentally and evidence-based. So if there is a question, scientists would like to try and understand it. They would carry out experiments, they would theorize, they would do mathematical equations, and they would look for evidence, both mathematically or from things that you can discover clearly with regard to life in the fossils. You weren't looking for evidence to support the assertion. So if there is no God and these things came into existence on their own, what evidence do we have that life can come into existence on its own? To things that took place. Scientists would quote very large numbers of millions of years. There was no one around to sort of record the actual evidence. So now we have to look up for observations and then theorize them about what might have happened at the beginning of life. So if we ask science and say to them, what are the theories for the beginning of life? What is the evidence for the very first living things? Because if you ask a scientist, as well as a believer in the Bible, in the beginning there was nothing. There was a dead world. There was no life. Scientists would tell you all about the Big Bang and how things happened at the Big Bang, but the point is, it was a dead world. There was no life in it. And likewise, the Bible begins, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form, and it was empty, and it was a dark place. And so actually, in that respect, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, has a huge amount of commonality with what the scientists would actually propose at that point in time. But there was no life there. So what are the theories for how that life came about? The theory of evolution, we're told, has got all of the answers, but just a moment, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Evolution will talk about monkeys turning into men. Evolution will talk about fish coming onto land and becoming lizards. I don't want to go down that line for the moment. I want to know, where is the first living thing? Where did that dead world have the very first living thing in it? Whether it was a cell or a virus or whatever it might have been, what was it? And actually, science actually becomes very quiet at this point, because if you go to Darwin will talk about a primeval soup of chemicals that somehow, somewhere on this earth, maybe at the bottom of the ocean or maybe at the top of a mountain, the right chemicals and gases would come together, and that maybe a flash of lightning would cause that dead soup of chemicals. It's a primeval soup, as Darwin refers to it. Maybe something in there could then come to life and be a living thing. That's all right. It's a good theory. Anybody's allowed to have a theory. But the question is, what evidence is there to say that there could be a dead soup of chemicals and suddenly there will be something come to life in there? And there is no evidence. Because if we say to a scientist, show me your experiment, show me some experimental data that says that something that is dead can come to life. And there is no evidence. There is nobody anywhere at any time in this world has done an experiment that says that. There are people like Miller and Urey who did experiments trying to mimic Darwin's primeval soup, and they were able to make some amino acids. Now our bodies, they're made up of cells, and in our cells there are something like 20 amino acids. They managed to make 4 of those, but it's only a chemical. They didn't make a cell. They didn't make anything that was alive. They basically carried out a chemical experiment and generated another chemical. But it wasn't life just because they happened to have made one of the chemicals that exists in our body. And a cell is so much more complicated than a chain of amino acids. A cell is so much more complicated. And so to actually go from something like that and to say, hey, we've made an amino acid, to say, hey, we've now made life, is utterly preposterous. That has not been the case. And so there is no evidence for something that can become, that was dead, that comes to life. And by the way, if you've waited for 1,000 million years for something to suddenly come to life, that thing that's come to life has to behave. Otherwise, you've got to wait another 1,000 million years for another accident to happen with chemicals to come together, and the next living thing maybe pops out of the primeval soup. And if it's not able to reproduce, well, you're back to square one again. So we're actually looking for what are the very first self-replicating forms of life, and science does not have the answer. It's like going down to the beach where the waves have been crashing on the shore, where there might have been, say, an iron ore seam going out to sea, and that the waves breaking on that iron ore seam just happened to have produced a cog. Just by chance, a cog. And maybe 2 or 3 cogs are there. And then somehow to say, well, in the next morning when I come down, or maybe a million years later, that those cogs have on themselves formed into a gearbox. And that gearbox can become a car on its own. Preposterous. But actually, any gearbox or car that's been made. And nobody would ever, you'd laugh at somebody who said, well, that car, that gearbox made itself. It happened on its own. We just happened to wait for 1,000 million years for it to happen. Utterly preposterous. So there is no evidence that science can put forward for that. And we therefore look at geology. Geology talks about very long time periods. And actually, when you look at the geological column, life has only existed for the last 10% of the geological column from the time when scientists would say there was a Big Bang. And then all of a sudden, in the fossil record, all of a sudden, there is a sudden explosion of life. Suddenly, the rocks are full of fossils. It's referred to in geological time periods as the Cambrian explosion of life. But the Bible was down to God. This was no accident. This was no chance happening of chemicals and a flash of lightning at the right time and pressure and temperature to cause these things. The Bible begins with, in the beginning, God. So the Bible utterly asserts the suggestion that there is a God, and this God has a plan, because it tells us that God created the heaven and the earth. For us, with our limited mortal minds, we have no idea how God did that. The very best scientists today still do not fully understand the entire workings of a cell, so they're still looking to discover it. We trust and we believe that in the beginning there was God. And we're told that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was there, and the Spirit of God, this is God's power. And so as Bible believers, we absolutely believe that there is a God, and that there is a God with power, and that God used that power to create. And so Genesis chapter 1, John said, let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God said, and it happened. Actually, that is exactly what you find in the fossil record. So you can look at things like fossil trilobites, which are like giant woodlouse. You can get little ones, you can get big ones. If you go up to Dudley at Wren's Nest, you'll see some good specimens up there. And when you actually find and look in the fossil record for trilobites, It's not like in one place of the earth you find the very first simple little trilobite, and then several million years later you find the next one spread a little bit further, which are a bit more complex, and then a bit further on a few more million years later. No. When trilobites appear in the fossil record in the lower Cambrian, straight after this explosion of life, they are already highly diverse. Suddenly, there's lots of different types of trilobite, and it's not just in one location and over a million years they spread. All of a sudden, they are geographically dispersed over the whole world. All of these different types of trilobite, all appearing at the same time. And so the more you dig into the fossil record, you actually find that the fossil record shows that what we have recorded in Genesis is not some fairy story for simpletons who cannot understand the wonders of the theory of evolution. Actually, the fossil record is a highly accurate record of paralleling with what we find in Genesis. And so the evidence that we see there matches what we find in the Bible. And so we have a choice that we all have to make. The original assertion was there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. That sounds as if you believe in a God, you're all going to be miserable and have a rotten time. Actually, we've got a choice. Both evolutionists and believers in the Bible, they need faith. Because faith is all about having a trust in something you can't see. So as an evolutionist, you need to trust in something you can't see because there's no evidence. Whereas we, on that side, we see that there is no God in that theory, that we see that the evidence that is around us is that mankind is here polluting and destroying this planet. So if there is no God, actually you better start worrying a lot, because there's no hope and there's no plan for this world, because man does not have the answers. Or you can have faith in a creator who's explained his purpose in the Bible, and a creator who's left the evidence in the fossil record to give us confidence, that what we read proves that there is a God. And so there is a God who has a plan, and God's plan is very much that man is not going to be allowed to destroy this planet. And so if you want a summary, it's simply this: there is a God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life.